By the spring of 1975, an ironworker named Larry Porter walked the open steel of the tallest freestanding structure on Earth, a quarter-mile above Toronto, in a belt that would let a falling man slip straight through. Then, on the 8th of March, the helicopter sent to lift the final antenna snagged its cable on the old crane and could not break free, a man still strapped inside as the fuel ran low. This is the story of the machines that built the CN Tower, and the people, the record books left on the ground. The helicopter, the trapped man, the fuel gauge falling toward empty, all of it traced back to a problem that had nothing to do with height. In the late 1960s, the city of Toronto simply could not hold a clean television picture. The downtown was filling with a new generation of skyscrapers, towers of glass and steel that climbed past the older broadcast masts and threw radio and television signals into confusion. Before the internet, before satellites carried everything, most of the city ran on line of sight, on point-to-point microwave links, and on antennas that needed a clear path to every rooftop and every living room. A television mast that had been tall enough in 1950 was now shouting from behind a wall of buildings, and the picture 3 miles away broke into snow. The tallest tower ever attempted was not born out of pride. It was born out of static. The company that decided to fix it was the Canadian National Railway, a company that owned a wide belt of derelict land along the downtown waterfront, the old rail yards that nobody had found a use for. The plan on paper was enormous. It was called Metro Center, a whole new district of offices and homes and public space. And at the heart of it would stand a single communications tower, tall enough to carry a signal over any skyscraper Toronto might ever build. The requirement was blunt. The transmitters needed to sit above 300 meters to clear the city, and the engineers decided that if they were going to build something that tall, they would build the tallest thing on the planet and settle the question for a generation. The tower would also become a hub for the microwave links that carried telephone calls and data across the region, so that beyond a clean television picture, a great deal of the everyday communication of southern Ontario would soon pass through this single point in the sky. Then the district around it collapsed on the drawing board. Within about 2 years of the first work, the wider Metro Center plan fell apart, tangled in money and politics, and most of it was quietly abandoned. The land would sit largely empty for another decade before anything else rose there. The architect on the project complained openly that the logic of the whole site had been upset, that the tower now had no district to anchor. What had been designed as the centerpiece of a new downtown became a single concrete spike standing alone beside an empty rail yard. The reason to build it, the signal, had not changed. So the tower went ahead without the city it was meant to lead. The people who would actually raise it were the Foundation Company of Canada, the contractor, working for the railway, with a design by the architect John Andrews and a structure engineered by a firm now known by the letters NCK. The shape they drew was strange and deliberate. Rather than a simple round or square tower, they gave it a 3-sided core, a hollow hexagonal spine with 3 great legs running down its outside, tapering as it climbed so that it was widest at the bottom, where the wind pushed hardest and slimmest near the top. That taper gave the tower its strength, letting it stand against a storm without having to be a solid block of concrete the whole way up. The numbers they committed to were extraordinary for 1972. The tower would reach 553.3 meters, more than 1,800 feet. It would top out in a little over 2 years. It would cost roughly 63 million Canadian dollars. And it would be built by a workforce that peaked near 1,537 people, working around the clock, 5 days a week, in a race against the calendar and the wind. If you want to keep watching the machines that actually built the modern world, Take a moment to subscribe, because the way this one climbed off the ground had never been tried at this scale before. Every tower begins with a hole, and this hole was a problem before a single wall went up. The ground the railway owned was old lake bed, and the water table sat only about 19 feet down, so the moment the crews dug, the water tried to fill the pit back in. A giant backhoe tore into the earth, while pumps ran without stopping to hold the water back. In all, about 56,000 tons of earth and shale came out of the ground, dug down roughly 15 meters at the center until the machines reached solid shale bedrock. That bedrock was the whole point. A tower this tall does not rest on soil. It rests on rock, and the engineers watched that rock the entire way down, sending men into narrow shafts to inspect the stone by eye along its full depth before a single drop of concrete was allowed to cover it. Keeping that pit dry was a battle on its own. The pumps ran day and night against water that seeped back in through the old lake bed, and the crews worked in a cold, wet hole beside a live railway line, in the one phase of the whole build that no camera would ever bother to film, because there was nothing yet to see but mud and rebar and men. What they poured into that pit was not a simple slab. It was a foundation shaped like the letter Y, 3 broad arms reaching out from a central hub, matching the 3-sided shape the tower itself would take. The raft held about 7,000 cubic meters of concrete and hundreds of tons of steel, poured to a thickness of nearly 22 feet at the core and thinning toward its edges. That thinning was another quiet piece of engineering, because a foundation with sharp, thick edges would have driven cruel pressure into the layered shale and cracked it, so the edges were tapered to spread the load gently onto rock that could not be allowed to split. Inside the raft ran a web of steel cables under permanent tension, tendons threaded down into 9 caverns and locked off, squeezing the concrete so hard that the whole base was pressed into compression before the tower ever pushed down on it. Concrete is enormously strong when you press it and weak when you pull it, and the water underground meant cracks could not be allowed, so the engineers pre-stressed the base to make sure it would never open. It took about 4 months just to build the thing the tower would stand on. And what they built next would climb 20 feet into the sky every single day, with men living on top of it. The method that raised the shaft is the reason the CN Tower exists on schedule, and it is the part almost nobody outside construction understands. It is called a slipform. Picture a moving mold, a giant open-bottomed form wrapped around the shape of the tower, filled with wet concrete at the top, while hardened concrete slides out the bottom. The form never stops. It creeps upward continuously, and as the concrete emerges from underneath, it has just set hard enough to stand on its own. The slipform for this tower was a custom machine supplied by a firm then known as Heide International and designed specifically for the job, and it rode upward on a ring of hydraulic jacks, as many as 54 of them, gripping steel rods and inching the whole platform higher, foot by foot, day and night. As the tower narrowed with height, the form had to narrow with it, the crews steadily trimming its edges inward so that the shrinking mold left the tapering walls of the tower behind it as it rose. The concrete was mixed on site and tested constantly, because a single weak batch anywhere in that rising column could never be pulled back out once it had set. The men who rode that form kept a strange schedule, up before dawn and working long after dark, finishing wet concrete by floodlight while the city slept far below them, every shift beginning a little higher than the one before it, and every worker trusting the concrete under his own feet to hold his weight. The pace was relentless. The form climbed about 6 meters a day, roughly 20 feet every 24 hours, and a tower crane climbed right alongside it to feed the poor. But climbing straight up for hundreds of meters raises a question that sounds almost impossible to answer. How do you keep something that tall perfectly vertical in the 1970s without a computer to check it? The answer was almost absurdly old-fashioned. They hung a heavy plumb bob, a weight on a line, down through the hollow core of the tower, and they let it settle in a bath of oil so that the wind and the vibration could not swing it. Optical instruments watched the form from its own arms, and surveyors on the ground tracked it from 1,000 feet away. A weight on a string, the same tool a stonemason used 2,000 years ago, kept the tallest structure on Earth running true. The whole system depended on human eyes and steady hands. A surveyor would sight the form, call out a correction, and the crews would nudge the jacks by a fraction, again and again, all the way up, checking the line 1,000 times as the tower climbed toward the clouds. It worked to a degree that still sounds like a misprint. Over the full height of the tower, the finished structure leans off true vertical by just 29 millimeters. That is 1.1 inches, across more than 1,800 feet of concrete. To put that in scale, it is a drift of barely more than an inch across a tower, taller than any building, then standing anywhere in the world. The Slipform was also a small town that never slept. A platform of men riding upward day and night, pouring and finishing concrete in the dark, higher every morning than they had been the night before. And this is where the danger stopped being an abstraction. The men on that steel worked in cold, hard wind, and the safety belts of the era were not the harnesses we know now. They hooked around the chest, and as the workers themselves later said, most of them would have slipped straight out of the belt if they had ever actually fallen. This is the detail that the engineering films leave out. The ironworker Larry Porter walked that high steel for $8.01 an hour, and that 1 extra cent over the man beside him carried a grim logic. The pay went up by roughly $1 an hour for every additional stretch of height a worker climbed above the crowd on the ground. Danger money, measured by the foot. They were paid a little more precisely, because the odds of dying went up with every level they climbed. This next detail rarely makes it into the story. On cold, windy days, a worker on the highest steel could stand still and feel the entire tower rocking gently underneath him, the whole structure breathing in the wind while he tightened a bolt hundreds of meters above the pavement. And still they went up, morning after morning, into that wind, onto a platform that never held still. At its peak, more than 1,500 people worked that tower in rotating shifts so that the concrete never stopped rising and the site never truly went dark. A small city of ironworkers and finishers and crane crews stacked one above another into the sky. If you are the kind of person who wants to understand how these things were truly built and not just admired, take a second to subscribe, because the tower was about to grow a shape that hung out over open air. Straight up had been the hard part to imagine, but it was the simple part to build. The real trick came near the top, where the tower had to grow a 7-story pod out from the shaft, a wide collar holding observation decks and a revolving restaurant hundreds of meters above the ground. You cannot slipform a shape that flares outward, so the crews did something else entirely. Near the summit, they anchored a temporary steel crown, and from that crown they hung 45 hydraulic jacks on long cables. Then they built 12 enormous forms of steel and timber down at the base. And over about a week, those jacks slowly hauled all 12 up the outside of the tower, hand over hand on the cables, until the brackets locked into place to carry the pod. Higher still, above the main pod, a second and smaller deck was built near the top of the concrete, a lookout that would become the highest public platform in the entire structure. Ironworkers framed all of it outward into empty space, more than 1,100 feet above the street, standing on beams that reached into nothing. Inside the finished shaft, 3 glass-fronted elevators would eventually run in the 3 notches of the tower, climbing at around 20 kilometers per hour, fast enough to carry a visitor from the ground to the observation deck in under a minute, while the restaurant above them turned a slow, full circle, roughly once every hour, so that a diner could watch the whole city turn past the window without leaving the table. Someone who was there saw exactly what that meant. A student watching from a nearby university rooftop, close enough with a long lens to pick out individual workers, remembered them tightening bolts with no net and no real harness, on cold, windy days, while the tower moved under them. That was not the only pair of eyes on the tower. All across the region, people watched the thing rise. From rooftops near the waterfront, from towns on the far shore of the lake, from an escarpment miles away through a pair of binoculars, ordinary people followed the tower going up floor by floor because there had never been anything remotely like it on the skyline before. Years later, the descendants of the crews would still talk about it. The draftsman who drew the plans, the men who did the framing, the relative who set the final piece. Down in the site office, the crews wondered whether they would be pouring concrete through another Toronto winter. The tower had become a public event before it had even opened. With the pod hung, only one problem was left, and it was the one that would nearly kill a man. The concrete shaft ended around 450 meters, and on top of it had to go a steel antenna mast reaching another 100 meters into the sky, more than 300 feet of it. The very thing the whole tower existed to carry. Without that mast, the clean signal over the city, the entire reason the tower had been built, would never have reached a single rooftop. The mast was built from rigid steel sections, cans of hexagonal steel, 39 of them, that had to be stacked one on top of the other with absolute precision and bolted together with more than 40,000 bolts. The plan was to lift them with the climbing tower crane, section by section, a slow grind that would take about 6 months and push the whole project deep into another winter. And that is when the entire story turned on the arrival of a single machine. If you want to see how these machines, and the men on them, finished the job, subscribe now, because the machine that arrived next very nearly killed a man. Enter a helicopter. A heavy lift, Sikorsky sky crane, an American machine flown up from Oregon, was leased to fly the antenna into place from above. The crews nicknamed it Olga. A helicopter could stack the mast in a fraction of the time a climbing crane could manage, and the newspapers of the day printed its flight schedule so that ordinary people could come downtown and watch it work. A helicopter carrying steel to the roof of the world. It arrived to change everything. But its first job was not to lift the antenna. Its first job was to reach down and pluck the old tower crane off the summit. And that first job went wrong within minutes. As the crew freed the crane so that the helicopter could carry it away, the rigging fouled. The cable snagged on the crane, the boom seized, and now the helicopter was cabled to a jammed machine that would not release. The pilot could not simply fly away, because flying away meant tearing the top off the tower or dragging the helicopter down with it. And a man was still strapped into the cab of that crane, hanging off the summit, tied to a helicopter that could not leave. There was no ladder to safety and no crane to lift them free, because the crane was the problem. High above the city, with the fuel burning down, iron workers climbed up into the rotor wash with cutting torches and began burning the seized bolts away by hand, one at a time, while the machine roared over their heads and the fuel needle fell toward the mark. Every bolt they cut was a gamble that the next one would be the last. When the crane finally broke free, the helicopter had 14 minutes of fuel left in the tank, which was the whole distance between landing and falling out of the sky. Far below, on the streets and the rooftops, the crowds that had come to watch a helicopter build a tower had instead watched it nearly fall. and for a few long minutes the entire project had hung on a handful of men with cutting torches and a fuel tank running toward empty. After that, the lift went the way it was supposed to. Once Olga began stacking the antenna itself, the work that had been scheduled for 6 months collapsed into about 3.5 weeks. Across roughly 55 flights, the helicopter set the steel cans one after another, the heaviest of them weighing several tons, while bolting crews chased behind to lock each section down, running 2 shifts, 7 days a week, from a platform that was winched slowly up the mast beneath them. Counting the mounting sections, the vibration dampers, and the working platforms, the helicopter made something closer to 44 separate lifts before the mast was complete. And here the tower nearly beat them one more time, in a way no camera caught. As the crews torqued the tens of thousands of bolts that held the mast rigid, the antenna pulled itself out of true. The act of tightening it down on one side bent the whole mast off vertical, and to bring it back straight, they had to reverse course, loosening one side and tightening the other, working tens of thousands of bolts a second time to coax hundreds of feet of steel back into line. The most precise part of the entire tower had to be straightened by hand, bolt by bolt, in the wind, before the plastic skin that shields the antenna from ice could ever be wrapped around it. That skin was a shell of plastic panels rather than metal, chosen because metal would have blocked the very signals the antenna existed to send, and it had to be fitted section by section around the finished steel by workers riding in a protective cage against the constant threat of a fall. None of this would have been allowed to happen if the tower had not already been tested against the wind before a shovel touched the ground. Someone had seen the danger coming long before the crews did. The shape of this tower, the way it was permitted to sway a controlled amount instead of standing rigid, came out of a wind tunnel run by a Canadian engineer named Alan Davenport, whose boundary layer wind tunnel laboratory had rewritten how the entire world designed tall structures against storms. Long before the Slipform climbed, a small model of the tower had already ridden out artificial hurricanes in that laboratory, spun and buffeted by fans that simulated 1,000 years of the worst weather the site would ever see. And the numbers it produced told the builders exactly how much the top could safely move. The men who felt the tower rocking under their boots were feeling something an engineer had already measured, predicted, and approved. Everything the tower had survived, every meter of that long climb, had been building toward a single day at the very top. On the 2nd of April, 1975, 785 days after the machines first broke ground, the last piece of final steel went on to the top of the tower, and it did not go quietly. A foreman named Paul Mitchell rode the summit that day in a hard crosswind to set the final section, and it fought him. It took 3 separate attempts to seat the last piece, and on one of them the segment came in backwards and had to be pulled off and turned in the air. Mitchell waited more than an hour at the very top of the world, in the wind, for a gap in the weather, before the steel finally dropped home, and he gave the word to cut it loose. At that instant, the CN Tower stood 553.3 meters tall, the tallest freestanding structure on the planet, and it would hold that record for 32 years, until a tower in Dubai passed it in 2007. For 32 years, no freestanding structure anywhere on Earth stood taller, and even now, nothing taller of its kind has been raised anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. And here is the part that separates this tower from almost every other story we tell. They built the tallest thing on Earth, in the wind, with belts that would not have held a falling man, and across all of it, not one worker fell to his death from the high steel. On a project this size, in that era, the absence of a single fatal fall is almost impossible to believe. The only life lost on the entire build was taken on the ground, not in the sky. A man named Jack Ashton, A consultant inspecting the concrete was struck in the head by a falling sheet of plywood and killed instantly. One death, at the bottom, on solid ground, on a tower where more than 1,000 men had worked for years in the clouds. That is the true human cost, and it deserves to be told exactly as it happened, without a single invented body added to make the story darker than the truth. For the men who had spent years in the clouds, that record carried its own quiet kind of pride. They had walked steel that would have killed almost anyone who slipped, in weather that would ground a modern crew, and every one of them came home when the tower was finished. The tower opened to the public on the 26th of June, 1976, about 40 months after work first began, and it immediately became what it still is, both a working antenna and the signature of an entire country. It carried more than a dozen television and radio stations over the very skyscrapers that had caused the problem in the first place, exactly as intended, and the whole enormous cost was paid back within about 15 years through broadcast rentals and the ticket line at the elevators. But the moment it opened, the tower began collecting a second life, a strange and human history that has almost nothing to do with broadcasting, and everything to do with the way people are drawn to the tallest thing they can find. If any of this is worth your time, you can support the channel with a coffee at the link below, because the second life of this tower is the strangest part of the whole story. It started with a party in the sky. In its early years, the tower held a nightclub near the main observation level, advertised as the highest disco in the world, with a signature cocktail served far above the streets of the city. Accounts differ on the exact years it ran, but for a time, the highest place in the country to dance was a revolving room served by elevators that climbed fast enough to press you gently into the floor as they slowed, where a floor panel could be lifted to look straight down the curve of the tower, and where fireworks, when the city set them off, exploded somewhere below the windows rather than above them. The tower had been built to solve a problem, and the public promptly turned it into the strangest venue in Canada. For a building meant to broadcast a signal, it had quietly become a place people simply wanted to be, as high above their own city as they could possibly get. Then it began to attract people who wanted to jump off it. In the summer of 1980, a professional stuntman named Dar Robinson stepped off the top of the tower for a television film, falling more than 1,200 feet down the side on a thin steel cable barely an eighth of an inch thick, a decelerator meant to stop him just above the ground. It was not his only fall from the tower, and the preparation was as frightening as the stunt. A test run using a bag of water matched to his own weight had already failed once when the braking system snapped, which meant the cable that would catch Robinson was a system that had already proven it could break. He wrote it down anyway and stopped alive, feet from the pavement, and he retired years later, having never broken a single bone in his body. The film of that fall traveled around the world, and for years afterward, the tower kept drawing stunt performers and climbers who wanted to test themselves against the tallest thing they could find. 6 years after that, on the 26th of June, 1986, on the 10th anniversary of the day it opened, a man named Dan Goodwin climbed the outside of it. Not with the elevators, and not with a crane, but with his hands and his feet, scaling the concrete up one face, then coming back to do it a second time, a human being clinging to the same surface that a helicopter had once fought. And through all of these years, the sky itself kept attacking the tower, over and over, in the most literal way. According to Environment Canada, the CN Tower is struck by lightning around 75 times in an average year, though researchers who counted the strikes optically have put the true number closer to half of that. On one violent afternoon in August of 2011, it was hit 52 times in 84 minutes, a strike roughly every 97 seconds. The tower simply absorbs it, carrying each bolt safely down long copper strips that run the full height into the ground, so that a building hit by lightning thousands of times has never once been in danger from it. It has stood through every storm the wind tunnel promised it could survive, and a great many it was never tested for, and in nearly 50 years of weather, it has never once faltered. The tower even turned its own history into a business. In 2011, it opened a walk along the outside edge of the main pod, more than 1,100 feet up, where paying visitors clip onto an overhead rail and lean out over the city with nothing beneath their feet. And there is a quiet, almost unbearable irony in that. Tourists now pay for the privilege of standing where the builders stood for $8 an hour with nothing to hold them, except that the tourists are safely tethered and the builders never were. The same open air that was once the most dangerous workplace in the country is now a ticketed attraction that thousands of visitors pay to lean out over every year. Which brings us back to the people, because in the end, this tower was always about them more than the machines. As the antenna was being finished, a section of it was set up at the waterfront where the public could sign it, and more than 7,000 schoolchildren wrote their names on the steel in indelible ink before it was lifted to the summit. Their names are still up there, sealed into the top of a national landmark, carried into the sky by the same helicopter that nearly fell out of it. And on the day the tower was officially dedicated, in the autumn of 1976, a time capsule was sealed inside it by the Prime Minister of the day, Pierre Trudeau, filled with letters, newspapers, coins, and messages from children across the country, set to be opened at the 100th birthday of the tower in the year 2076. So there are two sets of children woven into this tower. There are the ones whose names ride the antenna at the very top, written on the steel by their own hands. And there are the ones whose letters wait sealed in the wall below, addressed to a country none of them will live to see finished. The engineering documentaries will tell you the CN Tower was built to carry a television signal over a city, and that is true. But the machines only ever built the structure. The men on the high steel who never fell, the pilot who came down with 14 minutes of fuel, and the children whose names are still up there in the wind, are the reason it was ever worth building at all.